Hello there. Welcome to my weekly meditation. I am Reverend Devon, and if you are looking to nurture a progressive faith and are open to a second opinion, please know that no matter who you are or where you are in your life journey, you are welcome in this place. And so please also feel free to like and subscribe and share these messages with anybody you feel called to. Our reading today comes from Mark chapter 8, verses 31 through 38. Then he, Jesus, began to teach them that the Son of Man must undergo great suffering and be rejected by the elders, the chief priests, and the scribes, and be killed, and after 3 days rise again. Jesus said all this quite openly, and Peter took Jesus aside and began to rebuke him. But turning and looking at his disciples, Jesus rebuked Peter and said, "Get behind me, Satan, for you are setting your mind not on divine things, but on human things." Jesus called the crowd with his disciples and said to them, "If any want to become my followers, let them deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. For those who want to save their life will lose it, and those who lose their life for my sake and for the sake of the gospel will save it. For what will it profit them to gain the whole world and forfeit their life? Indeed, what can they give in return for their life? Those who are ashamed of me and of my words in this adulterous and sinful generation, of them the Son of Man will also be ashamed, when he comes in the glory of his Father with the holy angels." Hello, sisters and brothers. Welcome back to another weekly meditation at the Ascension Lutheran Church. We are in the second week of Lent, and we've been doing Lent pretty well, so welcome to my basement. I am taking a low-key day as I do this recording. And so today let's talk about this passage from Mark chapter 8. Jesus telling his disciples to take up the cross, to follow him, and to really accept that the path of discipleship, the path of trying to be a good person in this world, sometimes comes with hardships that we need to accept. Definitely a Lenten message. And so let's talk a little bit about this as it relates to this reading from the Gospel of Mark. So Lent is actually a pretty interesting time period for us within the church, because we do tend to focus on two parts of Jesus's spiritual journey. We focus a lot on that 40 days within the wilderness because Lent is structured around it, but we also focus on that moment where Jesus decides he's going into Jerusalem. And so, along with the Transfiguration passage where you have Jesus sort of transforming and going into Jerusalem, you have this passage where Jesus is really deciding for himself what the most important things are for his ministry. And I do think that one relates to the other, because here in this passage from Mark where Jesus is telling his disciples, look, I've made this decision. I'm going to Jerusalem. It's going to get me killed. Prepare yourself for that. Jesus' disciples are really blown away by this. They don't support it. They don't want him to die, and why should they? But Jesus has set his priorities, and he knows that he is willing to give up his life to show people how to live into God's love within the world. He's set on making a statement, and because he has those priorities set, because he's decided for himself in his faith journey what the most important things are, he's willing to take up the challenge, the burden, the cross, and responsibility of going into Jerusalem, of doing what he feels God wants him to do, even though that's a scary thing. And this lesson of setting our priorities, being willing to sacrifice for those priorities, I do think that that is something that we need to be paying attention to in this world today, where a lot of people's priorities really seem to be out of whack. So there's more to be said there. So the first thing I think I would say about this story is the story really does revolve around this interaction between Jesus and Peter. And I would say don't give Peter a bad rap on this one, even though Jesus is like, "Get behind me, Satan." I do think that Peter is representing an important element within our lives that tells us, hey, wait a second, you're getting into something too deep. Do you really want to do this? This is a conflict that we all have when we have to face decisions where we have to make sacrifice within our lives. And I feel that Jesus really is demonstrating what that looks like through this interaction where he says, I'm going to Jerusalem, I'm going to die, you all, be warned. And Peter really is that voice of self-preservation for Jesus. He's speaking of caring and compassion, but also he is, out of that compassion, out of that good intention, trying to draw Jesus away from what Jesus knows God needs him to do. And so there is sometimes an element within our lives at work that draws us away from doing what is good and loving in the world, even if the intentions behind that draw away from the call of God are good. And I do feel that that is something worth pointing out. And it adds a layer of complication to this passage, that we can, out of our intention of loving, not always live into the type of action that best represents and brings God's love into the world. The real difference between Jesus and Peter here is that Jesus has his priorities in order, and Peter is just learning what his priorities are. Jesus has already been through his wilderness journey, the 40 days before he started his ministry. He's already been through that transfiguration process where he has transformed and become the type of person that he needs to be in order to go into Jerusalem. And so he knows that what Peter is telling him is not the will of God. And I do believe that that is why he is telling Peter, look, what you're telling me doesn't benefit God. And if it doesn't benefit God, it benefits Satan. I don't think, again, that that is Peter's fault. I think that Peter just needs to grow to understand what his own priorities are, which eventually he does. And so here we have this passage that speaks to us in a very real way, especially in this time where our society finds itself, where we are so divided between our understanding of what is good. Our morals are so skewed up, both in politics, both in religion. We find a lot of folks, I feel, who do not have their priorities in order. And maybe most of us don't have our priorities in line quite as well as Jesus did when he went into Jerusalem. But knowing what the most important things are for you in your faith journey really can help you determine what voices are speaking to you from God's love and what voices are drawing you away from that love, because not every voice comes from God. So if we're talking about priorities in society, let's talk a little bit about Russia. And this is going to get political, so warnings. But a little while ago, Tucker Carlson went to Russia to interview Vladimir Putin. And the interview was, honestly, for anybody who supports Ukraine, quite insulting. He was throwing softball questions to Putin. He even went to a Russian grocery store and he's like, look how cheap everything is here, at least compared to American money. Wouldn't you prefer to live in Russia than live in the United States? And it was absolutely mind-blowing to think that this person who's speaking to conservatives here in America is saying Russia is a good place. Russia understands who you are, when you only go back 50 or so years where you have folks like Joe McCarthy rounding up anybody he thinks has Russian connections and throwing them in jail. I mean, the priorities that we see shifting there are quite mind-blowing, and it can show, really, I feel, that if you are not able to examine yourself and understand the most important things that you want to represent as a person in the world, you could end up losing yourself. And so what Jesus is doing here in this passage is he's sharing with Peter what loving priorities are. When Jesus goes into Jerusalem, he makes it very clear what his priorities are. Love God and love your neighbor. Everything else comes after that. Unfortunately, we're living in an era where a lot of Christians are not in line with the priorities of Jesus Christ. We look at other parts of the Bible and we allow that to come before the teachings of Jesus, and I feel that that is leading to a lot of harm within the world. As Christians, we are trying to align our priorities with that message of love that Jesus Christ gives us, and I feel that that is very, very important, because you can have your priorities in order and know what you're doing in the world, and those priorities can be horrible. Those priorities can be to cause harm. Those priorities can be to create disorder, or just to profit off of other people's suffering. And we see that in the world. We do see people who have their priorities in order and are using their power to harm others. That is not what Jesus is calling us to do. Jesus is calling us to set our priorities in a way that helps God's love reach everybody within this world. And in order to do that, that means we sometimes are going to be at odds with the things that keep us comfortable within this life. It sometimes means that we have to take up our cross and go to a place like Jerusalem. And we as Christians need to be asking ourselves, what are we willing to give up for those priorities? Those things that we know should come first in our journey with God. Because sometimes that voice of Peter is calling us. When we know that we have to do something good and correct and loving in front of us. And that voice tells us, you're giving up too much. Do you really want to do this? And I think Jesus challenges us, yes, if you know that it is the right thing to do, you should do it despite the sacrifice. That's a big call, and not everybody is able to do it within this world. But I think the example that Jesus Christ gives us is, when you can, you really can shake up this world in a way that will shift it towards love in a very fundamental way. Peace.